This is a moment we've all been waiting for. This is the last mini lecture for this entire class. It is also the last mini lecture for the female reproductive system. In this mini lecture, we will quickly go through what's happening during the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle as associated with the sexual cycle in females. And then we will wrap up like we did with males by taking a quick look at female sexual response. What's going on in the uterus is going to happen concurrent and as a direct result of what's happening in the ovaries. So remember that as we go through, these are not distinct or separate. They actually work together. It's part of that cooperative cyclic nature of the female reproductive system. Over the menstrual cycle, essentially what we're going to be seeing is this process where we build up the endometrium, and then if no implantation occurs, it is broken down and it is discharged from the body, and then we start again with building up the endometrium. This happens in 4 phases. So we'll start, we have proliferative, secretory, premenstrual, and then menstrual phases. We're going to start in the proliferative phase. The proliferative phase is where we are actually doing this first step. So we're building up the endometrium. This is going to start on the last day of the menstrual cycle. So we're not starting on day 1 here. We're actually starting on the last day of the menstrual cycle, which would be day 5, 3 to 5. At that point, the endometrium is very, very thin, right? And so all that's going to be is our basal layer. So not the functional layer, but the basal layer. That basal layer is going to be just 0.5 millimeter in thickness. Remember, this is going to be where we have our cells that will go through mitosis and recreate the functional layer. Estrogen that's coming from those follicles that are getting larger and larger and preparing for ovulation are going to trigger these basal cells to regrow and turn into the functional layer. So by day 14, we are going to see a nice thick functional layer on top of that. It's going to be 2 to 3 millimeters in thickness. So we've gone 4 to 6 times as thick as where we started. So we are sort of very rapidly building up this nice cushiony bed so that a fetus can come and implant and have access to warmth and nutrients and waste disposal services. On days 15 through 26, we are in the secretory phase. So this is going to start basically just after ovulation. Remember, we have that progesterone that's coming from our corpus luteum in the ovary. That progesterone is going to be sending these signals to the lining of the uterus that it is time to really bulk up. There is the potential, we've ovulated, there is the potential for pregnancy and implantation. So in response, the endometrium is going to thicken. We're going from 3 to 4 millimeters thick to 5 to 6. Most of that is going to be a result of fluid accumulation. So remember, we have these spiral arteries that go into the endometrium. We can see them spiraling through this basal layer here. They are going to start pumping out fluid into these structures and that is really, again, making this sort of nice, hospitable environment for a potentially fertilized egg. We also have endometrial glands. So these endometrial glands are going to secrete glycogen, which is stored energy, again, going to be very important if fertilization occurs. The last 2 days, so days 27 and 28 of the sort of luteal phase is also known as the premenstrual phase when we're looking at the uterus. During this time, we are going to start seeing breakdown of the endometrial lining. So again, here's that basal layer down here. This is everything we just worked so hard to build up. What happens is the corpus luteum in the ovary is going to start disappearing, and as it disappears, the progesterone that it's secreting is going to decrease. So that's a signal that, well, maybe there isn't an embryo to implant, there's been no fertilization, it's time to rinse and repeat, right? So to start over again. When that progesterone level starts to drop off, these spiral arteries down here actually start to have spasmodic contractions, which is going to result in inadequate blood flow. Inadequate blood flow is going to result in tissue death. So we start seeing sort of the surface layer of tissue dying off because we have interrupted blood flow, and then it's going to start breaking down, When we see that starting to break down, that's when menstrual cramps start. So those menstrual cramps are the uterus actually contracting and starting to help sort of rub off that internal surface. So sort of get rid of that internal lining with these little contractions. So usually menstrual cramps are going to begin a day or two before the appearance of any blood, right? Because we're just starting to help break down that functional layer. During this time, we get little pools of blood that are going to accumulate. Those pools of blood are going to mix with serous fluid. It's going to prevent clotting and just all sorts of liquids that are coming from this tissue that's breaking down. The combination of blood plus serous fluid is what gives us menstrual fluid. So menstrual fluid is not just blood, it's a combination of blood and the other fluids that were involved in prepping the uterus. From there, we move into the menstrual phase. So remember, the menstrual phase starts day 1 of the next cycle. During the menstrual phase, we actually get discharge of our menstrual fluid. So the blood and the serous fluid is going to leave out the vaginal canal. And so we are cleaning out or getting rid of all of that tissue that's breaking down. Total, we have about 40 milliliters of blood and 35 milliliters of serous fluid. So it's not actually a ton, but it is enough, right? It does also contain what's called fibrolysin, which is going to be a molecule that prevents clotting. So the blood doesn't clot in the uterus and get caught and break down in there. Okay, so this is sort of the ultimate, or this is not the ultimate, sorry, this is the other half of the figure that we were looking at before. So what we have here are we have our ovarian hormones. So these are the hormones being secreted by the ovaries. And then here we have what's actually happening in the uterine wall. And then down here we have our days. So in the ovaries, where we're developing our follicles, day 1 through 14 would have been the follicular phase, and 14 through 28 would have been the luteal phase. This is showing those same days, but as they're associated with the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and the premenstrual phase. So when we look at our hormones, we have estradiol sort of shown in this green, and then progesterone shown in purple. Estradiol stays fairly low until we're within about 5 days of ovulation. At this point, though, that tertiary or that Graafian follicle that's getting ready to actually be ovulated is going to really start pumping out estrogen. So we get this huge amount of estrogen, right? This is that peak that's going to signal the anterior pituitary gland to secrete luteinizing hormone. So we get this nice big peak, that biggest follicle ruptures, and then we get a drop off because that follicle stops creating quite as much. However, we do see that estrogen stays pretty high throughout the secretory phase and the premenstrual phase. As we hit that premenstrual phase, that's when it's going to drop back down and be low as we go through the menstrual phase, and then pick back up as we get close to ovulation again. Progesterone is going to be low throughout the entire menstrual and proliferative phase. Only after ovulation do we see the progesterone increase, and that is going to be because this is where the corpus luteum, those follicular cells are left behind, become the corpus luteum, and it secretes progesterone until we hit the premenstrual phase when it's degrading or degenerating, and then when the corpus luteum is gone, it goes back to basically baseline or 0. So what we can see is where we have progesterone and estrogen both drop down, that's when we start seeing our menstrual phase or premenstrual phases here stay low through the menstrual phase. We see our biggest increase in our functional layer depth when the estrogen starts going back up. So we get sort of a low, and then we can see that it follows that trajectory up, and then it continues. The progesterone here is going to help us really bulk it up with all that fluid and all that good nutritiousness. And then, assuming no pregnancy, it dips back down. Now, if there is a pregnancy, this progesterone layer, the progesterone level is going to stay very high because the embryo will, or the corpus luteum sticks around, and then the embryo and placenta start taking over that progesterone production, and so that will stay high throughout the pregnancy, which is why the premenstrual phase never begins. Okay, what I would suggest you do is actually look at the two figures. So the figure for the anterior pituitary hormones, the ovarian hormones, the ovarian cycle, and then the menstrual cycle. There should be, let me look at our book real quick. I don't know if our book shows all of that together. Yep. It's not as pretty, but if you can Google or sort of put those images together, page 1303 in our textbook shows all of the things happening at once, and it's really good to be able to see how all of those things are correlated with each other. So I would suggest you take a look at the hormones, all four of them together, as well as the uterine and ovarian cycles all together. Okay, so the last couple of slides here, I am just going to go through the female sexual response. It is very similar to the male sexual response, which makes a lot of sense because we have homologous tissues. There are obviously, however, some anatomical differences, so we do see some minor variations here. So we can start with unstimulated. So this is just looking at how the female reproductive organs are associated with each other during non-sexual response. So one of the main things to sort of keep in mind is the vaginal canal is fairly narrow, and then we see that this uterus tips anteriorly over the bladder. When we enter into excitement, again, so we have sort of those same responses with vasocongestion and myotonia. They're going to be happening in the clitoris instead of in the penis this time. We also see an increase in our physiological responses of heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. So those are the same exact responses that we saw in males. In females, what we also see is the labia majora and minora are going to have increased blood flow. So we're going to see swelling of those tissues. We get serous fluid. Remember, we have some vestibular glands and whatnot that are going to secrete fluids to help lubricate the female reproductive system. Not in the urinary system, there you go, down here. The vaginal canal is going to become dilated, so it increases in size, and then we get what's called the tenting effect. The tenting effect is this change in position of the uterus. So the uterus actually stands upright and points pretty much towards the head. That's a pretty dramatic change from what we see in the unstimulated female. So this is going to, ultimately, the goal of this would be to help guide sperm into the cervix and up into the uterus. Okay, so then during plateau, again, plateau is pretty much a status quo sort of situation where we maintain vasocongestion and myotonia. We see a maintained increase in our physiological variables. We see all of these things that happen during excitement being maintained. In females, orgasm is going to last a little bit longer, so we get about 3 to 5 sort of strong contractions of what's called the pelvic platform or the orgasmic platform. That is going to cause the cervix here to actually sort of dip down to where that sperm has been deposited. And the idea sort of evolutionarily is that the cervix is trying to sort of draw that semen up into the uterus again to enhance the chances of fertilization. We also see, what else? We also see that the physiological variables are going to spike, right? So we see rapid increase in heart rate, rapid increase in blood pressure, rapid increase in respiratory rate. So a female then will enter into resolution. At this point, the uterus returns to its original position, so it drapes back anteriorly, pointing more towards the belly button. Everything sort of relaxes and we begin to see blood flow moving out of the reproductive organs. And apparently I wrote this all out on slides. So there you go. You can read those. One thing that is different between males and females when it comes to the resolution period is that most women do not have a refractory period like we see in males. So they can go from orgasm back into plateau and orgasm again without having to go all the way back down to sort of the resting variables. And that is the end There is much more we could talk about, but we are going to wrap it up here, which is perfect. I'm right at 15 minutes. And so, yeah, thank you all for listening.